Alright, so here we are in front of the elephants.
It was a pretty sunset.
Cinema year 2023. Yes, we've made it. It's December. It's chilly up here in Burlington, Vermont. And I am coming through with, as I've done the last 2 Decembers, my year-end film discovery list for 2023. Basically how it goes is I grab a few movies that I have seen this year, of which this year I have seen 302 full-length feature films that I have not seen before. Just cracked the 300 mark this past weekend. I still have a few more to go because it's only mid-December. And I kind of just come on here and I take a few of these films that really impressed me a lot that I liked, but I'll also just kind of off the beaten path. This year I have 10, I'm trying to limit myself a little bit. I had 20 last year. It's a bit more manageable. So yeah, let's start it off. Number 10, 1958's A Story of Water, which is basically this kind of surreal romance short film. It was shot in 1958 during the Paris floodings, and it's this really fascinating film, at least for the reason that is the only film with co-directing credit for 2 of the largest names to emerge from the French New Wave, Francois Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard, co-directing this film together. And it comes in 1958, just before the French New Wave really starts to find its foothold in global cinema. Because 1 year later, Truffaut makes the 400 Blows. The next year, Godard releases Breathless, and then we get Valda's Cleo from 5 to 7, I believe, the year after that. And I mean, each of those end up becoming the defining films of their careers. But here we have this 12-minute short as a sort of preamble to the work they would go on to do. And, well, I didn't love it. I don't love it. It's a very fascinating historical document of the Paris flooding in the late 50s. That's really interesting to have it shot on film. And there is some really striking imagery as well, because to capture this story and to capture the environment, they had to shoot on canoes and shoot in calls and boats and all these. They bring a lot of movement to the film, which adds an interesting element to the process of creating it and seeing how they were able to even transport stuff during these insane flooding spells. But the story and the presentation are pretty absurdist in a rather unlikable fashion. I know that plenty of historians have since surmised that in the film's inception, Truffaut's screenplay was a slight, coherent romance narrative, but it was altered significantly in the editing room by Godard, who added absurdist voiceovers and percussion music while cutting out most of the plot, which kind of goes to show my main issue of Godard as an experimentalist and filmmaker who took Truffaut's kind of, grounded story and just grinded it up for a more visceral film experience, which was always kind of what Godard loved doing. And this kind of all comes to a head at the end of the film when there's you've had this meandering voiceover for over the entirety of the film, and then suddenly it changes to those voices kind of like an inner monologue of sorts, or the characters narrating their own story, turning into just speaking the credits to the audience while the film is still playing and the plot is still going on in the background, and then the film just ends. So overall, I would say interesting setup and atmosphere, but it just doesn't really particularly deliver on story or meaning, but definitely worth checking out for those of you who want to see some early examples of the French New Wave and see these 2 guys collaborate. All right, next up, number 9, The Vanquishing of the Witch Baba Yaga. This is a 2014 half-fiction, half-documentary project from Jessica Orek, who sets out kind of, it seems, to craft a modern allegory of the Baba Yaga folktale of Eastern Europe and how the text may kind of inform our present-day society. Now, she has mentioned this before in a lot of interviews when she was talking about the film and her other films, that overall her body of work kind of circles around ethnobiology, or the study of the way living things are treated or used by different human cultures. And with Vanquishing, Ulrich kind of traveled to Poland and Russia from town to town, just kind of going around for the documentary portions of the film, despite not really knowing the language whatsoever. But she did have this to say on the process.
There's a certain level of safety that I think subjects feel in the fact that I don't speak their language, because they, even though we're in their space and we're in their face with cameras, they still have a sense of privacy because we can't understand what they're saying. And I love that. I love being surrounded by people that I have no idea what they're saying. I find it really comforting. I lived for a year in the Arctic with a family of reindeer herders for the film I made while I was making this one. And none of them spoke English. And I would just sit around with these people and they would all just speak Finnish and I would just sit there, and it was so comforting and wonderful to me to just be not alone, but also be isolated. I find that a really fascinating thing.
And I will say, this film has some really interesting approaches to both fiction and documentary film. I can't say as I've seen a film that weaves them together quite like this, but I also would say this is a film that partly contains some of the trends of 21st century filmmakers using actual film stock that don't really appeal to me. So some of the cinematography in this has the film flashing and the numerous handheld reminiscent of like home videos from the 70s or 80s, but for me, little things like this always come off as a movie just trying to show off the fact that it's shot on film. I mean, the nostalgia factor is often lost because films that use film back in the day, they didn't need to do that. I mean, it's similar to when a lot of things shot on film these days just leave the film uncropped. So you can see the film perforations, you can see the top and bottom of the previous frames running. Many music videos do this. And I don't know, it's like I never really need to see any of the tail ends or the extra film idiosyncrasies of a film stock. Just show me something solid shot on film. That's a personal taste thing. Don't feel like you have to agree with me on that. That can be a fun aesthetic, I imagine. But for me, I guess it maybe just ends up feeling more like a flex or a brag than an actual focused use of the format like film stock. But also at the same time, it's hard to say whether some things are shot on film or just have convincing digital film filters. I don't have a good enough eye to tell the difference usually, so with that on top, it's kind of hard to tell. But, I mean, I will say there is still some very beautiful film stock cinematography in this movie, and that is definitely a draw. And the film's content itself dives into some really interesting juxtapositions of modern life and the childhood fairy tale of Baba Yaga. And that actually comes together in a very beautiful climax. It all kind of comes together in the end, which is really nice that it does that. It is nothing if not a film trying to recapture the world as seen through the imagination of a child, which kind of, with the juxtaposition of the documentary portions, is now kind of plagued with the past, present, and future of adult life. The realities of war and famine and the cultural unrest that has remained in Eastern Europe for the past century has shaped the culture and social structure in really fascinating ways, and Ulrich kind of captures that pretty uniquely. So it's definitely a very cool film discovery. If you can find it, I saw it on the Criterion channel. It's gone, I think, at this point. But if you can find it, check it out. And next up, our number 8 spot is going to go to 1974's Seizure. Now, Seizure is the debut film from director Oliver Stone, which it's a very different film from the rest of his filmography in many ways, because he doesn't direct another film for another 7 years until the 1981 horror film The Hand, which is a relative flop. And this is also coming around the same time with his prolific screenplay work at the time. He has the Oscar-winning screenplay Midnight Express, as well as Conan the Barbarian and Skullface. And this is before we would get films like Salvador, Platoon, and Wall Street that would really solidify Stone as a major Hollywood director, and he would kind of zero in on more what he wants to do in films. But for now, we have 1974's Seizure, and it stars Jonathan Frid, who played the original Barnabas Collins in the 70s TV show Dark Shadows, as well as Hervé Villechaize, which is, I believe, 1 year before he's in Man with the Golden Gun, because I believe that's 75. Now, the film follows a dysfunctional family on a weekend vacation in upstate New York, I think, around there. Picturesque ponds and woods surround this kind of large estate where the horror writer Edmund Blackstone's worst nightmares come to life one night and terrorize his family. The assailants are known as the Queen of Evil, played by Bond girl Martine Beswick, Spider, who's Hervé Villechaize, and a strongman named Jackal, Harry Judd Baker, another alum of the Dark Shadows show. And yeah, with any good directorial debut, Stone has yet to kind of hone in on a style or subject matter that suits his sensibilities. But considering the proximity between his tour in Vietnam and this movie being shot, it's fascinating to consider this as his first major creative statement in the industry. But Seizure also kind of fits into another horror film mini genre that I've mentioned before on the show of household horror. Because for the majority of the film's runtime, the family is trapped hiding within the house, but we are unsure what dark corners and windows are actually safe from the three antagonists. And other than separating the family members and picking them off one by one, it seems the intention of the sadist Queen of Evil wants to pit the family against each other to expose their true dark human nature, which often falls in line with Edmund Blackstone's own sentiments on society. And this tends to kind of bubble up within the property itself. So, I mean, overall, this film itself doesn't fully translate to a modern audience as the pacing, editing, and overall production is kind of hard to keep me interested. It is lower budget, but the script is not terrible, and there are fun moments throughout. I mean, the knife fight near the end, the foot race around the house with the family, and Hervé Villechaize's in general's performance is a cool one, so definitely worth checking out. I believe that one is on YouTube. If it is, I will link it below. The next film that fills the number 7 spot is going to be 1998's August 32nd on Earth, which we have another directorial debut, Denis Villeneuve's first film. First full-length, solo directing effort, at least. The description is weirder than the movie itself, but here it is. After escaping unscathed from a car accident, photo model Simone decides that having a baby is the only way to give her vacant life some meaning. She asks her best friend Philippe to get her pregnant, and he reluctantly agrees, on the condition that they conceive somewhere in a desert, so they leave Montreal on a 24-hour round trip to Salt Lake City to find a suitable spot. It's a fascinating kind of like angular look at human romance and intimacy, wherein you can kind of follow these characters who feel like they're trying to force their lives to happen, and yet in this, life tends to stand still and grow meaningless. Now, the plot is kind of thin, but the visuals are striking, especially in the Salt Lake City portion of the Salt Flats Desert, and the film certainly has personality that sets it apart from other low-budget debut feature-length films. But yeah, as for the watching experience itself, it can kind of drag on. It takes a lot of influence from European cinema practices and story structure, but the film is shot in Montreal and Salt Lake City, so that really adds a cool element. And Villeneuve's eyes are certainly there. It's just not quite fully honed yet in the way we would see with his future films. Now, it's kind of easy to look back and say, oh yeah, he clearly was going to go on to better things. This was early days for him. But I would say there were certainly moments of debut genius in this film that exceed the creativity even in some of his later films during his iconic 2010s run of films. Those being Prisoners, Enemy, Sicario, Arrival, and Blade Runner 2049. There is something about having no money, no reputation, but having so much drive to prove yourself and to make a real professional-looking film that leads to a director's best work sometimes. I mean, like, I think some of the more classic examples of this are Sam Raimi's Evil Dead. That's probably the ultimate example, honestly. Richard Kelly's Donnie Darko, Lynch's Eraserhead, even Wes Anderson's Bottle Rocket, all working with really cool things on a relative smaller budget. But yeah, worth a watch for sure. It's a spectacularly shot film. And also, I mean, we don't get enough Quebecois cinema at this level as well, so go and support it. All right, next up in the number 6 spot, we have 1994's Don Juan DeMarco, starring a late-era Marlon Brando performance in a really good, humbling, grounded role, and a young and hungry Johnny Depp playing the sexy and passionate Don Juan.
There are only 4 questions of value in life, Don Octavio. What is sacred? Of what is the spirit made? What is worth living for? And what is worth dying for? The answer to each is the same. Only love. Doña Julia was my first love.
And also above the line, basically the only directing effort from Jeremy Levin, writer of such films as The Notebook, Legend of Bagger Vance, and Real Steel. Dude has an interesting career. So all around, a very interesting combination of individuals coming together for this film. Essentially, the plot is this. A psychologist, only weeks away from retirement, Brando, is given one last patient, a young man who has convinced himself he is the desperado Don Juan, the greatest lover in the world, Depp. As the film progresses, we see the effect one has on the other as they learn more about themselves and what it means to be happy and alive, and if being sane is really even important. I liked this movie way more than I thought I would because, despite some obvious characterizations we know from him, this is a really holistic and unique performance from Brando, and a really relatively unknown one, because this is a film I had not heard of before. And this isn't even the only film that Depp and Brando do together in the 90s. It's so surprisingly human and unelevated of a character, and he really sinks into it in a great way, even adding, some really nice humor to the film as well. Depp is playing one of his least cantankerous or edgy characters of the 90s, certainly nowhere near his Edward Scissorhands or Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas or Sleepy Hollow characters, but this is probably his most 90s performance, in the sense that this script is very much of its time, in the way it addresses the troubled youth character. I look at the framing of protagonists like DiCaprio in Basketball Diaries or Drew Barrymore in Poison Ivy. There's this kind of tragic, dysfunctional upbringing that seeps into a rather low-stakes film premise to create heightened drama, and this is a theme we see a lot in the 90s. Depp's character brings with him these kind of fantastical dream sequences of his adventures that add a lot to the magic of the film as well, even making us kind of wish those dreams were real, but the reality is the reality, and the question this film's ask is how much can we strike a comfortable balance of those two worlds? Overall, yeah, it's a good time, and I'm not sure you'll find a better Brando performance at this late stage of his career. I haven't seen many others, but considering the reputations of Island of Dr. Moreau and The Score, I think this might be one of his best 1990 onwards. And if you like young Depp, you won't be disappointed. All right, moving on to our number 5 spot. We are now in the final 5, the top 5. We're zooming back 45 years from one of Brando's last to Brando's first film, 1950's The Men.
It was a bad shot, or else he was impatient. He must have aimed for my head, but he got me in the back. I was scared. I couldn't feel anything from my waist down. I thought I was dying. That's funny. That's very, very funny. I was afraid I was gonna die. Now I'm afraid I'm gonna live.
And this is not a particularly well-known addition to his iconic filmography these days, but it is a worthwhile watch, if not only for seeing some of the youngest footage we have of Marlon Brando acting, as well as some of the first notable credits for Stanley Kramer, who produced the film. In it, Brando plays Ken, an ex-World War II GI who returns home after he's paralyzed in battle. Residing in the paraplegic ward of a veterans hospital, fellow patients Norm, Leo, and Angel begin to pull him out of his spiritual dilemma. For 1950, this is difficult content to be covering in a film, and it's done surprisingly gracefully, mostly considering the intense research and preparation that went into it. The screenwriter and Brando himself spent weeks on end at the paraplegic hospitals the film was shot at, and most of the script was based entirely on direct dialogue spoken by real soldiers they encountered. Most of the supporting cast of the hospital were also just non-actors who actually resided there. Most notably, Arthur Jurado, who plays Angel, has a major part in the film, and he is a non-actor. Though you wouldn't know because he drops a great performance. There's a lot of moments I just really appreciate about the film, a lot of things that The film was willing to show audiences that other films just weren't doing, which is kind of in line with the Elia Kazan, Stanley Kramer Actors Studio kind of collaboration where they were doing message movies. They were talking about the biting topics of society at the time. But scenes like when one of the doctors sits all the wives down to explain to them like what their future might be with their husbands who do not have full capabilities with their bodies anymore. It's pretty hard-hitting at times. And the focus and persistence needed to portray a paraplegic like Marlon Brando's character is kind of staggering, and I think it is a great start to his film career. His kind of brooding, cynical character would only be one of a few he would play in his era, as his career would have more optimistic and more mysterious, alluring characters moving forward. And look to movies like, once again, Stanley Kramer produced The Wild One, Guys and Dolls, and even Streetcar Named Desire to an extent. But yeah, this is Brando's first movie. It's a good supporting cast. Post-World War II rhetoric is equal parts respectful and critical of the country's military and social position moving into the 1950s, and I totally recommend it. It's films like this that kind of make the 50s one of my favorite decades of film. And it is from people like Stanley Kramer and Sidney Lumet and the actors they work with, Brando and Newman and Fonda, that just created some amazing results when all these guys were working at their prime. And as for 50s films, this is not the last one on the list, so stay tuned. Next up, our number 4 spot, one of the most recent ones on the list, we are going to be talking about 2003's American Splendor. Another interesting weaving of documentary and fiction, kind of like Baba Yaga, but done in a very different way. This time we're discussing the life of perpetual grump Harvey Pekal, and who was the creator of the hit new wave comic American Splendor. This film is part of a wave of kind of early 2000s comic book films, not unlike Ang Lee's Hulk, that took a film adaptation of a comic book or some kind of film comic book story and rather literally created and weaved visual effects within the film that literally look like as if you're flipping through a physical paper comic book. This effect has, as it always does, varying degrees of success, but overall I think it comes off charming and mostly seamless. And this is a notable discovery for me because it is one of the first major examples of Paul Giamatti as a leading man defining the acting traits probably people know him best for, mainly the sarcastic, cynical, smirking grump persona who seeks to be an anti-hero or general antagonist wet blanket. It's partially formed in films like Saving Private Ryan and Truman Show, but at times nearly non-existent in films like Donnie Brasco. But if there are some films that come to mind that better display this persona, it's The Illusionist, The Ides of March, Morgan, and most recently The Holdovers, probably the best written example of this, maybe one of the best performances of his career. But no film earlier captures Giamatti's most iconic traits as an actor better than 2003's American Splendor. This is also his first, starring role, and it is a treat to be able to follow him throughout the film. He captures the spirit of Harvey Pekal pretty damn well, who really is this kind of sad, angry, confused character who, in a very special way, I think the directors can kind of show us that he is very much the American everyman who's not afraid to kind of talk about how shitty things are. And there's a certain comfort in that. Because after American Splendor, he would go on to do his other famous work, My Cancer Year, the one year that he had to go through cancer treatment, and he was able, with his wife, to document this experience. And it's just a really cool, powerful film in that sense, and a great performance from Paul Giamatti. So check it out. Good movie. Next up, we have the other 50s film I was talking about in the number 3 spot, 1953's The Hitchhiker. A riveting crime thriller about a hitchhiker who takes a car hostage in an attempt to evade the law. And it's a dramatization of the Billy Cook murder spree that took place from 1950 to 1951. And this film kind of makes it so high on my list, mainly for a few reasons. The pacing and tension creating in the moments with William Tallman, who's the criminal, is palpable. I mean, he is truly an unhinged man, and you are unsure of what he will do at any given moment. The progression of every story beat is so surprisingly believable and grounded for a crime thriller of this era, and Edmund O'Brien and Frank Lovejoy drop great performances as the helpless captives. This is also the penultimate directorial effort from Ida Lupino, one of the first major female directors in Hollywood. And this film is often cited as the only true original film noir directed by a woman. And with that come many other really unique differences that set this film apart from your boilerplate noir, which I don't think I've talked much about noir film on Film and or Film Asterisk, because I don't like it. I don't think Connor's very into it either. I'd have to check in with him. There might be a few examples he likes. But overall, I've never connected with the noir genre. And that doesn't mean I can't respect it. It's just not for me. It's not my thing. But this one absolutely works for me. And I think it's because it's taking such a unique stance with the noir genre. And the main one that I cite is that it's a rather bright film because it takes place mostly in the desert during the daytime. And unlike other noir films that mostly took place in dark cities with sinister alleys and dark rooms, it is the natural isolation of the desert that causes the claustrophobia and dread. Where can they run to escape? There's no near landmarks, no towns, no highways, and the foot trucks in the sand and dirt will lead the killer right back to them. This entrapment is rather ingenious for the time, and it's little things like this that really put you in the shoes, asking yourself, what would happen if this guy got into my car? I'd be screwed. So for that alone, this is happily making my top 3 of film discovery this year, and I can't recommend it enough. And now we are at the final 2. 1 and 2, I would say, are a little interchangeable, but there's a reason number 1 is at number 1, and this one is at number 2. So here we go. My number 2 film discovery, I'm going to go with 1961's The Misfits.
Scotch, I guess, and on ice.
Rime water. Scotch on ice, rime water. Well, cheer up.
I will. I just hate to fight with anybody. When you win, you lose. You know, when you're hard.
Well, you're free. Maybe the trouble is you're not used to it yet.
No, the trouble is I always end up back where I started. Never had anybody much. Here I am.
Well, you had your mother, didn't you?
Now, for most, this film is not going to ring any bells, but when considering the historical significance and eerie nature of the film all these years later, I consider it an insanely powerful watch. While filing for divorce, beautiful ex-dancer Rosalind Tabor ends up meeting aging cowboy turned gambler Gay Langland and former World War II aviator Guido. The two men instantly become infatuated with Rosalind, and on a whim, the three decide to move into Guido's half-finished desert home together. When grizzled ex-rodeo rider Perce Howland arrives, the unlikely foursome strike up a business capturing wild horses. Now, the lead cast of these 4 characters is then rounded out by Isabel Steers, Rosalind's landlady, who follows her and protects her on her adventures. And the eerie part of the film comes in when you realize that 4 of these 5 leading characters would not leave the 1960s alive. First is the leading lady, Marilyn Monroe, who famously passes away only a few months after The Misfits wraps production. It is her last theatrically released film. Next is the grizzled cowboy Gay Langland, in Clark Gable's final role. He passes away only 11 days after filming wraps. He never sees the film released. The ex-rodeo rider Perce Howland is played by a 38-year-old Montgomery Clift, who would pass away from a heart attack brought on by years of drug addiction and other various ailments that left him mostly inactive in the industry after his performance in 1961's The Misfits. And Rosalind's landlady was played by the incomparable and prolific Thelma Ritter, who died of a heart attack in 1969, only a week before her 67th birthday. The only surviving member of the 5 leads was Guido, played by Eli Wallach, who would go on to live to be 98 and pass away in 2014 after a long, celebrated career. And with all this in mind, the film was poorly received at the time, and the making of The Misfits was troublesome for many reasons. Not least of which was the fact that the on-set temperature of scenes in the Nevada desert, which make up the majority of the film's runtime, often reached peaks of 100 degrees or higher. Not only this, behind the scenes was the breakdown of Marilyn Monroe's marriage to writer Arthur Miller, the screenwriter of this film. Miller revised the script throughout the shoot as concepts of the film developed, and this was during Monroe's severe decline in health in her final months, abusing alcohol and drugs on and off set. Clark Gable himself tried to be as supportive as he could when Monroe was in this state, and in his own poor health at age 59, insisted on doing nearly every stunt that the role required, with the exception of being dragged by a horse 400 feet at 30 miles per hour. Other than that, every single stunt you see is him doing it. Even in the background, there are eerie moments of the film. Veteran B-movie Western actor Rex Bell made his final film appearance in a brief cameo as an amusing elderly cowboy. Bell was lieutenant governor of Nevada at the time, before passing away 7 months after filming wrapped, only 2 weeks before Marilyn Monroe. The Misfits was the last completed film for both Monroe and Gable, and Marilyn admitted many times that he was her childhood screen idol. In her last interview, Monroe, who never knew her father, said she often fantasized that Gable was her father. She also admitted that she hated her performance in The Misfits and disliked the film overall, which is a shame, considering that this may be one of her best performances in my eyes. This really isn't a bad performance in the film, and with all this star power playing off each other from scene to scene, you have the despondent and angular Montgomery Clift working with tired-out macho cowboy Clark Gable, the working-class and untrustworthy Eli Wallach, and the moral and strong-willed Thelma Ritter, all kind of brought together by the whip-smart and tragically enthralling Marilyn Monroe. It's in this insane assembled cast of pre-code breaking 60s. The film has since been praised for its forward-thinking attitudes, as it was one of the first less fantasized and elevated narratives of the American cowboys that were so prevalent in the 1950s. Instead of these strong-jawed, reserved, ruggedly handsome heroes keeping peace and honor in 19th century and pre-war American West, we have a contemporary film that shows the cowboy as a misogynistic, dying breed of obstinate and bigoted loners whose American dream was quickly realizing to be unsustainable. It's one of those great mid-century films you'll be lucky to see, and it translates very well to the modern day as we look back at this era and understand more clearly the societal dynamics at play in America. And geez, major respect to Arthur Miller for penning this great story. And putting John Huston's career into perspective, this film was not received well until much later, and this was a diamond in the rough of a patch of his career people often don't discuss. Because you have his initial run of films. You have Maltese Falcon, Treasure of Sierra Madre, Key Largo, Asphalt Jungle, and African Queen, and those are all well discussed and celebrated. But I don't think it's until 1967's Reflections in a Golden Eye that he really comes through with a period-defining film of the post-code Hollywood. And he kind of recaptures the magic in a lot of people's eyes. But this is perhaps my favorite statement from him as director, and it bridges the gap of so many generations of actors and film audiences that it's riveting to see it all go down. And that final scene with Marilyn Monroe, her final scene in a movie, it is really just devastating. So I can't recommend it enough. It's a tight 2 hours. You won't regret it. And here we are, at the end of the list, my number one film discovery from this year. Not a complete unknown, but certainly one I had never heard of. And for 2023, it's going to be 1988's La Bamba. Directed by Louis Valdez, starring Lou Diamond Phillips in his breakout role. The one thing I can really say about what impressed me most with this biopic about 50s rocker Ritchie Valens is the intimacy of the film and how it is able to keep the story to just Ritchie and his family's journey during his maturing into a national sensation of rock and roll. Roger Ebert may say it best when he said that this is a good small movie, sweet and sentimental, about a kid who never really got a chance to show his stuff. The best things in it are the most unexpected things. The portraits of everyday life, of a loving mother, of a brother who loves and resents him, of a kid growing up and tasting fame and leaving everyone shocked that his life ended just as it seemed to be beginning. The gravity of Ritchie Valens' legend, and if you know his life story, was not lost on me, because I really didn't know Ritchie Valens' story fully in detail. And how the film can cover so much of an infamous fable in the history of music is just remarkable. And it's able to keep the heart of the film by balancing this historical weight with the grounded story of a Mexican-American family struggling to survive and be accepted in 1950s America. I cried at this one. I cried a lot. It was a beautiful film from beginning to end. And there's something to me about someone so full of life, taken before their time, that is the saddest tale we can recount in cinema. It's the optimism and innocence of Philip's performance, and just the obliviousness to the greater world and the looming specter of fate that is truly the affecting narrative of the film. One of the best films I've never heard of that I've seen in years, one of my favorites of the 1980s in general now, and yeah, what a magical rock and roll biopic that does it better than nearly every other one. And yeah, those are my 10 film discoveries that I recommend. Some lesser known films that I loved and maybe you would love too. I always love doing this year-end episode, just being able to talk about my film discovery before we get into Andy's season, which very much is on the way. Me and Connor, especially now that the strike has been resolved, have been working hard to see as many 2023 films as we can, all the ones we are excited for. I know I have at least a dozen more I want to watch. But yeah, until then, have a lovely holiday, have a lovely rest of the year. Thank you for listening, and stay warm out there.